I'm enormously pleased to talk about Han Saussy. He is, of course, university professor and now finishing his first year here. And it's very challenging to list his specialties since there are so many of them. He did his undergraduate work in classics, Greek, and comparative literature at Duke. He then went to Paris to study linguistics and Chinese at the École pratique des hautes études and then at the Institut national des langues orientales. His French is, parenthetically by the way, therefore fluent and utterly perfect, which was not necessarily the intent of the process. He got his MPhil and PhD from Yale in 1990 and has since been on the faculty of stellar institutions, UCLA, Stanford, Yale, and now, of course, the University of Chicago, where his primary base, I'm very proud to say, is comparative literature. Needless to say, we all hope that he feels he's finally come home. Han has been president until recently of the American Comparative Literature Association and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Let me begin by noting first that Han is committed to human rights, as is attested to by, for example, his recent book, Partner to the Poor, a Paul Farmer Reader. There Han writes, and I quote, "The assignment of viability is the precondition for human status. Those not yet in being or no longer in being lack a forum in which to be heard. That condition of being outside the reach of rights is one they share with many people currently in existence." Han has worked intensely to see that such a forum can be had, that those outside the reach of rights can be heard, that the work of someone like Paul Farmer can be made known and accessible, that bioethics is a constant point of reference. Han is also the foremost spokesman for the field of comparative literature in this country. He's the editor of Comparative Literature in an Age of Globalization, 2006, which defines the state of the discipline now. His own essay, in his own essay of that volume, Han writes, "The controversy is over. Comparative literature is not only legitimate now, as often as not, ours is the first violin that sets the tone for the rest of the orchestra." Apart from the fact that this is very good news to read, it's also a typical Han metaphor. He loves to combine intense intellectual inquiry with down-home language. His Nashville origins never cease to provide him with an ironic, persuasive rhetoric, even when he's writing about a Chinese poem or aesthetics. He contributed to designs, for example, for sculptural installations at a San Jose library, or Ferdinand de Saussure's course in General Linguistics, a new and better expanded version of which has just been published with Han as co-editor. He's written on Haitian poetry, Chinese musicology, Chinese women poets, the Chinese character as a medium for poetry, and much more. Great Walls of Discourse, a book that came out in 2001, considers, in Han's words, the career of China as an object of knowledge. It is a beautiful combination of wit, sinology, and comparative considerations of historical and social contexts that surround each work under scrutiny. He also, with wonderful comparatist élan, has combined his knowledge of French poetry with Chinese literary tradition. One of my personal favorite essays of Han's appeared in Representations in 2006, entitled Death and Translation. The article looks at the early 20th century poet Zhu Jimo. Is that a decent pronunciation? Translation into Chinese of Une Charogne, a particularly creepy poem by Baudelaire about a rotting corpse on the street. In wonderful Han style, he writes, and I'm quoting Han now, "Baudelaire is not a night owl, much less a rising lark. His voice is like that of a wounded cuckoo that has coughed up all its blood." And then in typical modesty, Well, but you put it into nice English. And then in typical modesty combined with such deliberate translations, vaguely Nashville-esque, Haun adds a quote, "I'm just a country bumpkin. I can do no more than mouth Baudelaire's poetry. I don't understand it, but genuine music asks only to be listened to." Well, I can tell you that Haun himself on Baudelaire is masterful, subtle, and reads him as well as any scholar in the field. No country bumpkins here. These are just a few areas to which Haun has devoted himself. He also speaks and reads an alarming number of languages. So I take this opportunity to thank those colleagues who helped to make Haun a member of our faculty, among other things by writing letters of excitement and enthusiasm at the prospect of having such an extraordinarily distinguished colleague. I thank our dean, Martha Roth, for facilitating everything about the process and for her continual support. And above all, I thank Haun for coming to Chicago, and also his wife, Olga Solovieva, who is a postdoctoral student, person here, student not. And above all, I thank Haun then for coming to Chicago and becoming one of us with such apparent ease, much to the delight and enrichment of us all. And I think I speak for all of us in comparative literature when I say we're just as happy as a June bug on a warm summer's night. Please join me in welcoming Han Saussy.
Thank you so much, Françoise. I wish I could believe that such nice words were true, but they're very comforting to hear. It's just a delight to be here in Chicago. It's been 6 months of continual inauguration. I wake up every morning wondering if it's true, and it continues to be true. And having me do my inaugural lecture after 6 months, I guess, was a trial period. And so, the squeaks and bugs have been ironed out, and people have decided to keep me, for which I'm intensely grateful. Not least because people here come to lectures, even on a beautiful May Friday afternoon. Hard to believe. So the talk is called Askance from Translation, and I'll explain that somewhat strange title, or try to. Much of the basic mental equipment with which we approach problems of comparative literature derives from the puzzles and the experience of translation. Of course, the translation of literary works forms a primary given of comparative literary history, but when we try to justify what we are doing in more theoretical terms, we often find ourselves falling back on words such as correspondence, equivalence, version, rewriting, adaptation, paraphrase, or the cases that force us to think a little harder, such as non-correspondence, non-equivalence, and the much beloved incommensurability, which comes necessarily training clouds of overstatement unless the context is mathematical. Indeed, although we are always saying that what we do in this discipline is not exactly comparing, or not just comparing, it is a hard discipline to try to do without the partial, total, relational, or aspectual equivalences on which the relationships we pay attention to hinge. I would like to persuade you to make room in your minds for an other to translation. Not the other of translation. That, I suppose, would be non-translation, the claim that we can't or shouldn't seriously translate or put certain things through the mill of translation, a line of thinking that whether it is a ban or an abdication seems to me antithetical to scholarly work. The other I have in mind is vanishingly close to translation, so much so that it is often mistaken for translation. It happens usually at close quarters to it and achieves grosso modo the same ends. To see this other, we have to look at translation, but to look askance, to look away from the specific operation that translation, in the most classic formulations of that term, performs. What I have in mind is something of a twin and something of an antagonist to translation. It calls on resources different from those of translation. It has its distinct effects. It makes us do different things and engage with bits of the world in a different way. And not just in texts, and it results not just in texts, but in languages, creoles, whose relation to other languages is different from the relation among languages that only translate or not into each other. I hope the following is the most banal thing I will say to you this evening. In translation, the meaning of a sequence in language A is reproduced or transferred or made to happen again under the forms of a sequence in language B. Whether this ever occurs is a matter of how particular we are going to be about it. It is a subject of some notoriety that the beginning of the Gospel of John has been translated from Greek into Latin, into French, into Arabic, into English, into Chinese, and so on. Had that not happened, an incalculable number of other events in world history would not have taken place. But it is always open to us to demur and say that that passage has never been translated, or never been translated fully or accurately or well enough. The subtle ones may assert that the Greek is so strange in form as to give rise to doubts that it may itself be a translation from a lost Aramaic original, which the Greeks may not have translated correctly either. As Emily Apter put it so well at the beginning of a recent influential book, nothing is translatable and everything is translatable. Take it as an inescapable antinomy. If we are looking for equivalence, nothing will satisfy us but tautology, which won't satisfy us either. So we must wait for miracles, or at least ingenious surprises, which good translators do sometimes give us. Some 50 years ago, Willard Van Orman Quine framed the problem of the indeterminacy of translation in the following way. Suppose that there is a people somewhere whose language has never been translated into any language known to us. The only way to begin trying to understand what those people have to say will be what Quine calls radical translation, namely standing around waiting for the locals to produce speech in response to objects and events that may arise, and trying to correlate the sentences they utter with the events to which they purportedly respond. A rabbit is cited. There is some controversy about how much of the rabbit or how reliable a rabbit is at issue. And the speaker of the as yet untranslated language remarks, gavagai. Now, what is the linguist to make of this? Is gavagai the word for rabbit in the undeciphered tongue? Is it not possible to go wrong? Could gavagai be predicated only of undetached rabbit parts, or of time slices of rabbitry, or of particular kinds of event to which a rabbit sighting is a contributory but not an essential element? It would not be unreasonable, as a matter of correlations, for a beginner to think that bless you was the word for sneezing in English, rather than a ritualistic response to a sneeze. At any rate, the idea that gavagai is the name of the rabbit and that those who pursue the wily gavagai may sometimes end up with gavagai in the pot will begin to seem naive to us as we ponder the reasonably conceivable alternatives. It is even possible that the object or event to which gavagai is the salute corresponds to nothing ever formulated in English to this day, something that, until someone tries to formulate it, might as well be inexpressible. With such considerations, Quine wants to rob us of our innocent assumption that words designate objects and that different languages just use different words to indicate the same objects. He ups the difficulty, the unlikelihood of translation. That worthy enterprise is not my subject today. I am interested rather in the fact that this anecdote, under its patina of New Yorker cartoon corniness, now functions as a signal to which a community reliably and determinately responds. Show up at the Logician's Lodge one foggy Wednesday night, throw open the door and shout, gavagai. They'll know what you're talking about. Even among people with scanty logical training like myself, the gavagai example is recognizable without further introduction, an old friend from the exhibit room of philosophical problems. This is somewhat remarkable because gavagai was invented at first to be a word that had no known meaning in any language. It has been foisted on the English language and many other languages besides, not because we know what a gavagai is, but because it became the name for the condition of not knowing for certain whether one knows what one is. Is this acquired familiarity with gavagai a result of translation? Well, of course not. For one thing, there was never a previous language from which the translating could be done. And if translation is a transfer of meaning across differences in linguistic form, it will fail this test as well, for the meaning is up for grabs and the form, in English and all other languages in which I have seen the argument cited, remains the same, gavagai. Even the Gavagai Cafe, a business establishment in Taiwan, you can Google it, uses the familiar Roman letters to write its name. The side effect of Quine's gavagai example that I want you to notice sits askance from the practice of translation as usually understood. The word repeats rather than being interpreted. And repetition does not usually count as interpretation or argument. If you've written an undergraduate paper from me, you've probably seen that comment in the margin, in fact. Now, some parts of language we expect to go without translation. Proper names, for example. It would be strange to say that the translation of Hillary Clinton is this or that language's pronunciation of Hillary Clinton or Silaili Kulingdun. Rather than a translation, we and the State Department should refer to that as a transliteration. Someone could say that André is the French translation of the Greek name Andreas, like the English name Andrew, but it would be picking a fight to insist that every André become an Andy when on Anglophone soil. We expect a proper name to repeat, not to be versioned across languages in most cases. Where versioning occurs is in the case of the names of saints or of Mickey Mouse. That alerts us to something generic and not merely proper about the proper name. Thus, the proper name, as a consequence of its particular status, transliterates and does not translate. A nonce word like gavagai behaves similarly. If I were to ask you what the word for gavagai is in Russian or Portuguese or any other language in which the problem of indeterminacy has been discussed, you could truthfully answer gavagai, though you would not thereby have answered any of the questions Quine wanted to ask. So not everything translates. Not everything has to translate or is expected to translate. Translation is not the necessary channel for every kind of communicative exchange. How big is the territory of exceptions to the rule of translation? Quine mentions cases in which it is easy to ignore the problem of translatability, cases where the uncertainties are taken care of for us. For example, when two languages are so closely related that finding equivalence is almost automatic, or where two historically unconnected languages, say English and Hungarian, have in their backgrounds centuries of shared cultural history and institutions that make it possible to find the same things that are spoken of with different words. Quine is not much interested in these cases. In fact, he rejects them, for, as he says, it is the discontinuity of radical translation that tries our meanings. Those meanings are most visibly put to the test when the sentences to be translated across a radical cultural gap, I'll quote here, are extremely theoretical. Thus, who would undertake to translate neutrinos lack mass into the jungle language? If anyone does, we may expect him to coin words or distort the usage of old ones. We may expect him to plead in extenuation that the natives lack the requisite concepts, also that they know too little physics. Thus far, Quine. You see what I mean about the New Yorker corniness, right? The natives, the jungle language, and so on. The more theoretical the content of what is to be transmitted, the more obviously it depends on a network of related words, activities, machines, and other theories, which must be accounted for somehow if we are to get the meaning of the theoretical statement across. Quine's genius was to see that this is always also the case, though usually not obviously so, when we are doing something as simple as commenting on the appearance of an animal in the tall grass. But it is easier to call attention to rabbits than to neutrinos. Importing into what Quine calls, embarrassingly, the jungle language, the whole conceptual apparatus of subatomic physics seems a bizarre mission, something that Quine mentions only to awaken our sense of absurdity. Rather than translate the physics textbook, why not just teach one of the locals English so that he or she could go on to get the physics from a less questionable source? That calculus of benefit blocks us from noticing the interesting thing about translating the physics textbook into the language of the forest dwellers, namely the compulsion to coin words or distort the usage of old ones, right? As Quine says in a phrase meant to make us put that out of our minds. The act of translating would do violence to the language into which translation is being done. Quine does not stop to look into that violence, that twisting and turning, but we should if we are to discover what lies just askant off translation. I think I may have just coined a word or distorted the usage of an old word in saying the phrase, what lies just askant off translation. Askance is a word in English, but I'm not sure that I know what it means. I know how to use it. I can say that theorists of translation look askance at transliteration, but just what kind of relation askance denotes is a little vaguer in my mind. I thereby verify, but in alas, far humbler register, what my teacher Jacques Derrida once said, I have only one language and it's not mine. Trying to lay a firmer hand on the English language, I turned to the Oxford English Dictionary, where I learned that askance is probably an imported word, but no one is sure from where. Although fossilized and appearing now only in the set expression to look askance at something, i.e. to look on it with disapproval, loathing, or contempt, the word had from the 15th to 18th centuries the meaning sidewise, obliquely, askew, asquint. The dictionary's citations from Milton in Paradise Lost tell the story of the word, which also gives in small compass the story of the world as told by Milton in Book 4. The devil with jealous leer malign eyed them askance. Book 6. Whom the grand foe with scornful eye askance thus answered. Book 10. He bid his angels turn askance the poles of earth. It's really all you need to know. As for the etymology, it is unknown. I quote the OED. Wedgwood suggests Italian asciancio, bias, slanting, sloping, or slopingly, a slope across, over, thwart. Koch suggests a formation on Old Norse aska. Diefenbach compares Jutlandish adskans, West Frisian skan, scan, which he connects with Dutch skuin, skuins. There is a whole group of words of more or less obscure origin in ASK, containing askance, askant, askew, a sky, a skyle, a skoy, a skoin, which are more or less closely connected in sense and seem to have influenced one another in form. They appear mostly in the 16th or end of the 15th century, and none of them can be certainly traced up to Old English. Though they can nearly all be paralleled by words in various languages, evidence is wanting as to their actual origin and their relations to one another. Thus far, the OED. Not passing down the direct line from Old English, but colliding sidewise or askant with early modern English, whether coming from Italy, from the Netherlands, or from the far north, the word askance gets its force of meaning from a whole group of words of more or less obscure origin and undefined meaning, continuing to slide along from the point of impact into the domain of the figurative. The dictionary editors continue. In the figurative phrases to look, eye, view, askance, the idea expressed has varied considerably, different writers using them to indicate disdain, envy, jealousy, and suspicion. The last of these is now the prevalent idea. Well, if the idea expressed has varied so considerably, it may be a fair bet that no one using the word askance has had a particularly clear sense of what it means, except that it denotes an orientation somehow distorted, perverted, and devalued, as distinguished from what is direct and upright. The word's history looks to be an example of lexical indiscriminateness. A word of uncertain provenance comes into the language, is used in a number of vague and possibly mutually inconsistent ways by authors who may well have had another word in mind. In other words, it exemplifies the behavior that I see as running contrary to the idea of translation as the substitution of one known meaning for another. Sometimes there are no substitutes. Let us suppose that we are translating a text from language A to language B, whatever languages you will. Sooner or later, a word will come up that refers to a particular circumstance of the climate, flora, fauna, customs, or arts of country A, for which no precise equivalent in country B for the moment suggests itself. And this is the case where one says, that thing they call sherbet, or amok, or kismet, or sharawadji. Then one goes and explains the thing that has just been named by its foreign name, its name in language A. It is always possible, I hold, to explain sherbet or sharawaji. That is how we honor the principle of mutual intelligibility. But in so doing, we mark the foreign thing with a name that does not come from language B, the language in which we are doing the explaining, but rather reproduce a name from language A. We thereby transcribe. We become mimics. If the foreign word subsequently takes, it becomes the word in language B for the item we were trying to translate from language A. And we speak of it as a loan word. The term is significant because it is a lie. A loaned object is one you sooner or later have to give back to the giver. But we have been using sherbet since the Middle Ages, amok since 1642, sharawaji since 1685, kaolin since 1741, and show no signs of returning them to the speakers of Farsi, Malay, or Chinese. The feeling that the word is not completely ours, that it belongs somewhere else, makes us call it apologetically a borrowing, though in fact we snatched it and intend to keep it. To tell the truth, we couldn't do without it now. All languages are packed with loan words. Much of what is not loan words in a language is calques, that is, formations of native words used to imitate a foreign word, or to imitate the effect of a foreign word. Interaction, a word somewhat overused these days, though for a good purpose, was coined around 1830 in imitation of a German term, Wechselwirkung. Translation was coined in ancient Rome to imitate the Greek metaphora. And who knows how Wechselwirkung and metaphora emerged, possibly as calques on a precedent term that we have lost track of. As long as it is still recognizable as such, the loan word is mildly shocking. It sticks out like a sore thumb or a new penny. Take, for example, the telephone in China, one object among hundreds described in Lydia Liu's Chronicle of the Translingual Practices of Modern Chinese Writing. When this object was new and began to be used in the international districts of Shanghai, some people referred to it as the de Lufeng. From the sound of it, I assume the original term was French, téléphone, rather than English, but no matter. It was definitely foreign, as you can see from its three-character structure, and the fact that the word sequence is semantically absurd. If you didn't know what a téléphone was, how could you guess from hearing it named, as it is in this loanword compound, as a wind of virtuous proportion? Afterwards, or perhaps simultaneously but in a different neighborhood, someone with a stricter sense of linguistic propriety created a name for the new thing that made it seem as if it had always already had a name in Chinese. Dianhua, electric speech. Dianhua correlates meaningfully with such other objects and institutions as dianying, electric shadows or cinema, dianbao, electric messenger or telegraph, and so on down the 19th century's list of amazing media discoveries. Dianhua, properly speaking, translates the telephone. De Lufeng transcribes it. Dianhua and De Lufeng correspond to two profoundly different attitudes about language, about the Chinese language and foreign languages, and about innovation or importation. It is convenient for our exploration that many 20th century Chinese neologisms exist in both forms, the transliterated foreign word and the semantically motivated native compound. Dianhua, the neologism wrought from ancient Chinese roots, proclaims the readiness of Chinese to make room for all kinds of new things, as if they had been there all along and just needed to be noticed to acquire a name. The exotic ring of the De Lufeng, on the other hand, accuses the Chinese language of incompleteness, asserts that there is no way to name this new thing without taking out a foreign loan. Loan words are an opposite to translation in the following sense. With translation, interpretation always precedes the restatement, but with loan words, incorporation occurs without interpretation. Someone says De Lufeng, and you have to figure out what it is. Translation works out what the meaning of the foreign text is, then elaborates a corresponding set of meanings that will suitably address the speakers of the target language. With transliteration, foreigners are putting words in your mouth. As often as not, this happens quite literally. Many of the things named with loan words are products meant to be eaten. Asapiling, aspirin, for example. Someone could have created a phrase like 止痛药, the medicine that stops pain, right? Also a name for that sort of thing. Or given a chemical definition like acetyl salicylic acid, for which there is certainly a name in Chinese. I don't know it. But asapiling, like aspirin, denotes a brand name, not a category of effects. It comes in a package with a seal. One must insist on the packing and the seal because they must materialize the mysterious character of the classic loanword, the fact that when you handle one, you never quite know what the contents are, but simply convey it as a lump or unit. There is no analytic knowledge to be derived from the a, s, pi, and ling of asapiling. Contrast 止痛药 with that designation, stop pain medicine. You know immediately what kind of product it is and what it is supposed to do. Presumably, people dislike handling mysterious packages of unknown origin. They also have trouble remembering them. So in Chinese, many loanwords have been devised so as to carry an interpretation with them. The borrowing was incorporation with no interpretation, pure mimicry, as when English speakers imitated the sounds of amok, ketchup, kayak, or samurai. But the Chinese language, where every written character has at least a vestigial meaning, allows this mimicry to be doubled with an appearance of sense, so that vitamins, wei ta ming, suggest that they have the function of guarding one's life, or Viagra, wei ge, offers to equip you with a huge brother. Genius, sheer genius. As these examples indicate, the semantic supplement added to the pure loanwords is mostly in the nature of advertising and not always to be taken on faith. This is not precisely translation, but a technique of borrowing that is cleverly adapted to the context of the arrival point. We should refine our initial formulation then. It is not so much incorporation without interpretation, but incorporation separated from interpretation. The interpretation comes after the incorporation and is optional, poetic even. Nonetheless, the fact that incorporation can be separated from interpretation installs a strangeness in language, a zone of vocabulary where the mouth acts independently of the mind and where the native speaker and native competency are no longer in command. In such situations, the wholesale use of loanwords and alien constructions is sure to provoke anxiety about purity. Speakers of the language as it used to be feel that it is being adulterated. That might be precisely the point. It may seem that transliteration is a stage on the way to translation, that the process should result in a natively rooted new word signaling the successful adoption of the foreign thing or concept. That is, the idea is that Delufeng is a stage on the way to Dianhua, alienation preparing for a new recognition. But the sequence does not always go that way. Sometimes the paraphrase comes before the mimicry. Sometimes mimicry is brought in to replace an existing and well-received paraphrase. In the history of long-term linguistic or cultural relationships, we see waverings between the appropriative modes of translation and transliteration. The deciding factor seems to be prestige, or the question of where semantic authority, or its shadow, semantic suspicion, are to be found. The first renderings of Buddhist texts into Chinese in the early centuries of our era groped for familiar equivalents in existing discourse, which turned out to be mainly found in the authors of the Taoist canon. Thus, the concept of nirvana was translated as wu-wei or non-action, an impressive, in fact, inconceivable metaphorical leap, but possible under the circumstances. Meditation practices characteristic of India with its long history of yoga were expressed with the phrase shou-yi, quoted from Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, where it means something like preserving single-mindedness. These and other feats of cultural accommodation, motivated by the prestige of Taoist philosophizing and the non-existent reputation of Buddhist philosophizing at the time, were superseded, however, a century or two later, when a more exacting translator named Dao An wrote a scathing preface to his Chinese version of a Sanskrit text in which he accused the earlier translators of having settled for popular phraseology that made nonsense of the subtleties of the original. Dao An could make that case only if a public was ready to agree that the foreign texts held meanings that were worth struggling to attain. The remedy, according to Dao An, was to make new Chinese sentences with a word order that had never been used in Chinese before, and to imitate the sound of Sanskrit mantras with strings of nonsense syllables. The resulting prose was not immediately intelligible to anyone without specialized training, but through the mimicry and incorporation of Sanskrit, it assured the reader that the concepts were being transmitted in all their purity, without fudging or compromise. Like an early Lawrence Venuti, Dao An put a value on foreignizing translation, the kind of translation that most consumers of translation would describe as incomplete, and that we can now describe as a mix of translations and transliterations. Such mixtures, with transliteration remedying the reported impossibilities of translation, may be called creoles. Dao An and his fellow translators invented a Sanskrit creole of Chinese that became the official written language of Chinese Buddhism. If an 1890s Rip Van Winkle were to rub his eyes and open a contemporary Chinese newspaper, most of what he would fail to understand would be the result of creolization processes involving Chinese, Japanese, remotivated literary Chinese, English, and other languages. Creoles are the languages that make the heaviest use of loanwords. In them, the transliteration process reaches its greatest scope. Creole languages grow out of contact situations that preclude the possibility or the desire of searching for equivalents in the mode of translation. Some conditions impose a vocabulary on a population, where there is no attempt to translate but only to inculcate. Consider Haitian Creole, a language that consists of words largely taken from French, set into grammatical patterns deriving from West African languages. French remains for Creole a reservoir of available terms. A Creole language still in contact with its source languages is something of a membrane through which signs pass in both directions, though probably mostly in one direction, given that the world of cultural resources is tilted and has an upstream and a downstream to it. According to a likely legend, the planters of the colony of Saint-Domingue made sure that the slaves on any estate were an assortment of speakers of different African languages, taken from different regions, so that no large number of them would be able to plot together and rise up against their masters. The medium of communication between slaves and masters, and then of slaves among themselves, was thus necessarily French. But opportunities to have sustained conversations about wide-ranging topics in French were presumably few. The slaves learned French words empirically and were not encouraged to become fluent or grammatical speakers, not to mention readers and writers. Some did anyway, like Toussaint Louverture, whose effects on the French-Haitian relationship are well known. Creole developed in this condition of limited language contact. It has an elegant grammar consisting of a small set of rules, having wide flexibility of application. Many features of French that would appear as merely historical nonsense if the French Academy had to explain them to a visiting delegation from another galaxy, such as the reason for the gender of inanimate nouns, are discarded. Creole is packed with French words, but these words have split off significantly from their French meanings and been adapted to the prosody of the new language. The logic of incorporation and mimicry does not mean at all that the imitation will be slavish. Rather, as in this instance, a Creole language changes and recombines the elements it has taken from a predecessor language. As a framing scenario, let us remember that Creole emerged from a social condition in which the future Creole speakers were not meant to have a language at all, except for the purpose of understanding commands. The collective ingenuity of millions of Creole speakers has confuted that theory of language. But they did this not by miracle, but transforming the paltry givens of their situation. And to do that, they started from the signifier. Among linguists, Creole refers to a type of language, not a specific idiom or language group. What makes a language a Creole derives from the relation between that language and one or more predecessor languages. Its very aggregate quality recommends Creoleness to an age of hybrids. At the risk of false universalism, I use Creole in a typological sense, but without forgetting its historical sense either. Although the two meanings are not identical, they do intertwine. In a gesture of impurity, I treat Creoleness as identical to the dynamic of transliteration, despite the fact that Creoles were usually considered illiterate jabbering when they emerged and did not attain written status until hundreds of years after their creation. By invoking the transfer of the letter in the word, by calling these transliterations, I do not mean to muddle the historical sequence, but to recall the inscription, as literary critics like to say, that takes place every time a loanword is adopted. Inscription happens massively in the creation of creoles. Acts of reduplication, of repetition distinct from interpretation, that are more like printing or impression than like speaking or expression. All this is to say that translation is not the only way that two languages can be connected. If we are thinking about cultural contact and transfer through the model of translation, as we too often do, the specific kind of non-translation that generates a creole will remain simply invisible, or its difference from semantic translation will be elided. Yet there is a difference, and if we can be more precise about it, we should be able to draw the analogy, the translation, of both the translation and transliteration models of linguistic sequences in literary and cultural terms. I will characteristically use the via negativa and go through counterexamples. Emily Apter's The Translation Zone, a book I mentioned earlier, concludes with a fantasia about digital communication as the ultimate extension of translation. For it is becoming clear, she says, that digital code holds out the prospect, at least, of translating everything into everything else. A kind of universal cipher or default language of information, digital code will potentially function like a catalytic converter, translating beyond the interlingual and among orders of bios and genos, liquid and solid, music and architecture, natural language and artificial intelligence, language and genes, nature and data, information and capital. Thus far, Emily Apter. Similar uses of the term translation are also favored by theorists of technology. Lev Manovich remarks of binary code that it serves as a visual Esperanto for word, sound, image, movement, money, every kind of data and difference in the world. Quoting him then, in new media lingo, to transcode something is to translate it into another format. The computerization of culture gradually accomplishes similar transcoding in relation to all cultural categories and concepts. End of quotation from Manovich. Here then is translation carried to an extreme, for Esperanto was supposed to be the universal language, the language for which two-way translatability was guaranteed. But Manovich's transcoding, translating metaphor, however appealing, is precisely the wrong one, for digital media do not interpret the contents they vehicle in any meaningful way, therefore they do not translate them. Your computer does not understand the word file you type into it, or express its content to another computer's understanding when you email your file to a friend. Rather, it codes the letters and formatting into a sequence of ones and zeros, that are then copied onto the hard disk and recopied through instructions onto the other person's computer, then re-represented as letters and formatting. Transliteration again, incorporation without interpretation. Translating or summarizing content is when I tell you about a conversation I had last week with somebody, is something else. Media do not deal with content. They vehicle content, they permit it to be packaged, they subject it to algorithms and encoding, but no more. And when we deal with digital media, as with technological objects generally, we do not open up the black box, so to speak, and understand its coding from the inside. Rather, our relation with media is one of quotation, block citation, repetition, selection, and use. A digitally mediated message is in Creole to the extent that it is complex and multimedia. I cut and paste, I drop a film clip or a photograph into a PowerPoint presentation. To do this, I do not in the least need to understand the movie camera, the digitization process, the computer program that runs the film clip, or the LCD screen that lights up to display it. Each of these things for me is, practically speaking, a black box with a button on it, and a cable that I can use to connect it to another black box. This is wonderful because things happen regardless of my subjective incomprehension of the process. But the linking up of blocked and chunked automatic operations in this way is what makes us always already post-human. So most technology is inscriptional and transcriptional rather than translational, just to assert that difference. We use translation to talk to other humans because humans are keyed to the meaning-based behaviors that translation can address, but machines are good for repetition, and that alone. When we use loanwords, when we devise creoles, we are acknowledging the repetition, the inclusion of machineness, of otherness in ourselves, transcription as the internal limit of translation. What are the consequences of distinguishing transcription from translation, catachresis from metaphor, inscription from internalization? I can think of several ongoing projects that might be modified to the extent that their current shape depends on an application of the translation model. One result would be to give a new meaning to the much decried term formalism. Creoles are all about forms colliding in new sequences that have not been prepared in the realm of pre-existing meanings. Form would then shed its aestheticist connotations, and its Platonic ones as well, and become the agent of a consequentialist, pragmatic, material story about artworks. If a word is an instrument, if, for example, the word sherbet serves to create the possibility of and the desire for sherbet, literary works produce their content through the action of their combinations of forms. The kinship with ideas about the performative, about inscription, about historicity will be clear, I hope. All this has been known for a long time. I merely want to urge us to pay attention and to see the systematic links among the artifacts. Another result, troubling for philology, would be to consider that the language is in the work as much as the work is in the language. A work of intense creolization like Finnegan's Wake begins to look like the standard case and not like an oddity. A work like the Zhuangzi that has been treated again and again as a kind of code book for introducing hitherto unimagined foreign ideologies into the Chinese thought world contains more kinds of Chinese than it is contained by. Right? It's contained by one variant of Chinese, but it contains and generates all kinds of other unexpected versions of Chinese. This is, to say the least, paradoxical. Theorists of media like to cite Marshall McLuhan's aphorism that the content of a new medium is an old medium. For example, early cinema tried to replicate the look and feel of stage plays. This is true as far as it goes, but it amounts to seeing the new medium as the translation, the equivalent in new formal guise of an old one. What would happen if we were to insist on the incipient Creole character of the new media product, the respects in which it does not frame an old media object, but is somehow disturbed and exceeded by the imported old content? To continue with our example, how does live theater deform and constrain the pure possibility of cinema? It is traditional to consider the stage play era of cinema as a transitional phase of growth, after which cinema gradually discovers its own potentials and leaves stage acting behind. But what if cinema were to be thought of as remaining to the end of its days an unstable compound of technological artifact and stage representation, with stage representation itself an unstable compound of earlier genres, and so forth? No medium, in the story I'm sketching out, would ever be able to discover its genuine properties because it would have none except through contact with the other media that are not itself. The interpretative cast of the humanities would come under mild suspicion as well, as inextricably linked to the model that I am calling translation, and not so easily brought into relation with what I am calling transliteration or Creole incorporation. Wilhelm Dilthey, as you know, offered a kind of charter for the humanities 130 years ago, seeing that they were about to be pressed into irrelevance by a new set of disciplines centered around experiment, technological innovation, and practical applications. Dilthey contended that although the sciences explain, the humanities interpret, and they do so by using the individual scholar's mind as a kind of identificatory apparatus. The natural sciences deal with the realm of necessity, the humanities deal with the realm of freedom, and as freely choosing human beings, we immediately understand what is going on in documents left behind by other freely choosing human beings. This understanding, says Dilthey, is the reason for the humanities' continued existence. I am far from wishing to take away a reason for the humanities to exist. Please, give me that at least. But we could say that insofar as this model of intersubjective understanding passes through and depends on the realm of meaning, it is a cousin to the translational mode, and the transcriptional mode I am urging you to consider today looks more like the blind causality of things that goes in what is not the humanities. Explanations are reductive. We all know how to stigmatize reductivism. But by their reductivism, explanations force us to imagine doing without the phenomena that reductivism doesn't preserve, perhaps a productively alienating position. Let us venture more, I suggest, into the realm of explanation, confident that whatever we try to make conform to the canons of mechanical causality, it will prove to be a creole of translation mashed up with transcription, humanities mashed up with sciences. Media theory, as I've already suggested, with its investments in object-centeredness and temporal discontinuity, often puts us into that awkward linguistic position. And so, while hardly qualifying as a media theorist, I benefit from its lessons and urge that they be read back into the record as far back as the record goes. In all this, I suppose I am trying, as many people in avant-garde movements and literary thinking since about 1900 have tried, to make the signifier the active and primary, not the passive and secondary, bearer of artistic energy. The argument is that we don't express ourselves, rather we discover ourselves through our cultural forms, which are not usually our own. For this, in fact, an alien form may be best. It doesn't tell us what we already know, though it is hardly certain that we will be able to get from it any message that we did not in some way possess beforehand. What it can do is teach us new ways of behaving that leave us at odds, askance from our former selves. Thank you.
So, Han Saussy has very kindly agreed to answer questions. So when you ask a question, Dustin Simpson will be passing you this microphone, which works only for that little black box, but is, as you know, useless in this context.
I'm going to, predictably enough, given who I am, or at least who I impersonate, go back to a word you used in passing, and as most literary scholars do, only use in passing, and that's performative. But I want you to think about your sense, at least initially in your talk, of the differences, perhaps the conventional differences that you were adumbrating, and then by the end of your talk, I think you maybe blurred the differences between, on the one hand, equivalence, correspondence, the work of translation in the text, and then thinking about mimicry, repetition, borrowing, as against the convention of translation, correspondence, equivalence, and so on. Because it seems to me, once creoles become creoles, let's say Haitian Creole, but also, since I'm thinking about it right now, Afrikaans, both of which in fact come out of slave cultures. But at the moment, if you want to use Dilthey, where they become the languages of freely choosing people, even freely choosing people within the constraints of slavery, repetition becomes performance, already shifts the meaning and the significance. And I'm using significance as distinct perhaps from content meaning. Something else happens. I'd like you to think a bit more, rather than asking you a question, about performance and about the moment, either historically or categorically, where we recognize a Creole as a language, and therefore as the imagination and creation of meaning, not just repetition. Because it seems to me by that point it becomes harder to make the hard and fast categorical distinctions that you were perhaps making earlier with Quine. Perhaps throw Quine at Austin, but you may think about performance and this moment in which Creole becomes something else.
Okay, so did people hear? I'm going to I'm going to chop things up, unfortunately, in the paraphrase, but it has to do with the role of performance at the moment of incipience and self-recognition of a language that has a Creole origin. Right, and here, I think it's interesting that the Creole languages I'm familiar with, anyway, begin in a situation of diglossia, in which another language has the power, as it were, in which a lot of performative utterances could not possibly have been made in the Creole language, but would be made in the high status language in that particular place and time. And so it might not be so much the origin of the language as the moment at which that language becomes a possible medium for uttering official statements, for example, statements in the name of the state, which in the case of Haitian Creole came true only in 1983. Maybe that's the important thing. But then this interval between the origin of the language, it's the interval that's interesting when the Creole language is basically not quite recognized as being a language, right? But being some sort of a, lots of pejorative words for things that are not languages, but the people around you speak, right? So that's a situation that's fraught with maybe a more interesting tension than is possible after the language has achieved this kind of recognition. Right? So I am tremendously interested in that kind of situation.
I'm waiting for the
Sure, and I would say that
I'm going
it's a magic microphone.
I'll hold the mic here so that I don't harm your eardrums. Is there ever a moment for you in your account where translation or something like translation is wholly absent? That is to say, is there a kind of immanence to transliteration that exists apart from understanding, hermeneutics, translation? Is there something like that? Or is translation always happening and it's just a matter of emphasis?
Well, I think the machine is the example where repetition is happening without any understanding having to go on. But of course, machines are invented by humans and they're completely coated with human purpose and so on. But
we could never aspire to the condition of the machine, right? That's not, you would not want us to aspire to that condition. That would not be the kind of vanguardist gesture you would want to endorse.
Well, I know people who would be satisfied to answer yes to that question. I think for me, it's more about recognizing the machinic that is in that's in language and in culture, but also tracking our secret, hidden from ourselves, Platonism or idealism. Right? I think a lot of things are happening sort of under the cape when people invoke translation, and everybody loves to talk about translation. I omitted a couple of pages of blah blah about how translation is the metaphor of metaphors and the thing that makes us all feel good, and exercising a little bit of hermeneutics of suspicion on that good feeling. You never want to feel too good about something, right? But so that's really my aim here is to show that the machine is definitely at work within us, and it helps us to discover the trickiness of the lingering Platonism.
Okay. I'm struck by the way you have used the word transliteration. I wonder what term you use when one goes, say, from the Arabic graphic system to the Roman graphic system, but still pronouncing the word the same way. And I'm also struck by your association of Creole with transcription when Creole is primarily an oral medium.
Yeah. Well, The second one is something that I was very happy about, because it's an instance of, you know, the letter in kind of the broad theoretical abstract sense, right? The use of repetition and incorporation and inscription, it happens exactly like a letter, even though there may not be empirical writing going on. And so I was excited about that, because that connects with another bunch of things that I've been working on about the history of theories about oral literature and so on, which I won't bore you all with. It's a long story. But so I was definitely hoping to get that effect of disbelief in connecting transliteration and inscription with creolité, because I do think that there's a reason for it, but it happens on the level of the process rather than on the level of the historical event. Right, transliteration between two languages. Well, here, part of the trick is what does any writing system capture, right? You mentioned going from Arabic to Roman letters, something that has happened within living memory with the Turkish language, right? And of course, the Roman alphabet could be adapted for use by Turkish speakers in some ways that made it more friendly than the Arabic language, you know, because vowel harmony being so essential in Turkish, it was difficult. I don't know how Ottoman Turkish works, but I do know that this is one of the advantages of the Roman alphabet that was trumpeted back in the 1920s when people were making that shift. So there, it's a situation that you know, that I would like to know more about. Right? What changed? Can we simply say that nothing changed in the Turkish language but the alphabet, or did other things change? It happens that historically a lot of things changed because there was a whole wave of language reform, and the vocabulary was pruned of foreign words and all kinds of other stuff. How much of that was tightly connected to the change of alphabet, and how much of it was just a subsidiary enterprise that someone saw as advantageous to link with the change in alphabet?
I think I'm concerned with simpler things such as Madame Hillary Clinton instead of Mrs. Hillary Clinton.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Simple things like that. They do make a lot of difference. Right. But the question is, what can we capture in the shift from one to the other, and how can we motivate a choice between the two of them? I guess, you know, a difference that doesn't lead to a choice is baffling. But if we can find out what the consequences are of one or the other, then something happens.
I want to ask you a question about gavagai.
Okay.
Now, as I understand it, Quine doesn't care whether the native speaker of gavagai means isolated rabbit part or rabbit entity, as long as we can figure out behavior that will somehow count as communication. So I take it that he, at least on one reading, is a kind of behaviorist and doesn't care what happens inside our black boxes.
Right.
Now I'm wondering if that's a view that you feel equally happy with or not.
Well, Quine's whole set of arguments, I really just approach in an instrumentalist sort of mode. I'm happy to have him note that languages are tightly woven and they're complex. No term can be taken apart from the other ones and so forth. You know, that reference is not a simple matter of holding up an object and saying a name, but that a lot of other things are going on. But yes, I mean, he's pursuing several different games that I'm not really so much involved in. As a behaviorist, I think to some extent, it's behaviorism is an extremely useful stance for looking at things that one thinks one understands, right? Because it's like the requirement to explain things in mechanical terms, right, in terms of already known processes, it might not correspond to our inner feeling of how things happen, but the requirement to explain things in that way is stimulating and useful. So I think one could be behaviorist by interest, if not by conviction. Oh, great. Hi.
I wanted to ask a question about loanwords.
Mm-hmm.
You made within relative proximity the following two statements.
Mm-hmm.
That a loanword is mildly shocking
Mm-hmm.
and that its incorporation independent of interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if those two things can both be true.
Mhm.
If, in other words, there isn't some interpretive basis within which the shock is either intended or takes place. And I wondered, related to that, if you would comment on the phenomenon of faux amis.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. Well, faux amis would be something like loanwords that one doesn't recognize as loanwords. You know, the sneaky ones. I think the thing that is shocking about, mildly shocking about loanwords is that they don't look like the rest of the, you know, the phonetic series. There's something funny about them. They don't have precedent. Nobody is vouching for them. You know, the usual xenophobic set of problems. So in that sense, the interpretation is merely by contrast to the rest of the context. Right? They're not intrinsically shocking because one doesn't know what they are intrinsically. But you know, a word that is partly mysterious and of unknown origin. That's the shocking thing about it. So I guess there's a sort of a blanket interpretation that is automatically invoked when something unknown comes over the horizon.
Yeah, just a small follow-up. That does involve an interpretive choice
Mm-hmm.
to use the loanword at that point. So I guess the
Sure.
question is, what for you is interpretation
Mm.
that is lacking in that kind of incorporation?
Sure, sure. Well, the interpretation happens separately from the incorporation is the argument, right? So again, I'm just reasoning from the examples, and you know the way that a native speaker is baffled by de liu feng, right? It's very different from the situation of encountering dian hua, where the two elements make sense together, right? You can, if you didn't know what a dian hua is, you could look at the words and figure out from their roots. You couldn't do that from de liu feng. Right, so that's kind of the shock. So it's got more to do really with the possibility of some kind of an etymological understanding of language. Right? Along with faux amis, there's the whole category of folk etymologies, right, where people supply the etymologies that are not there. And in fact, they simply impose them on them. Right? And that is something that to me is extremely interesting. It sort of indicates that the mind is not the mind is restless when it doesn't have an explanation for something.
Speaking of loanwords, just a footnote, you said quite truly that the term loanword is inaccurate.
Can you hear back there?
Yes, you said quite truly that the word loanword is inaccurate, especially but the fact that there is one exception, one historical case in which the term is perfectly accurate, in which a certain vocabulary was lent and borrowed and then taken back. This is in about, I think 1952 it was, Stalin decreed that the copies of Russian and international words that had already been assimilated into other Soviet languages were henceforth to be written, therefore pronounced as well as they could be, in Russian, according to Russian spelling. So that words like Askance, railway station, which have been assimilated into Uzbek and Tajik as Askance, have been assimilated as Askansa, were to go back to Askance, which, however they violated native norms of practice and so on. So this is a case where, in fact, you might say in terms of the introduction of what he meant to be the first sounds of the violin of Russianization of ancient faith for the rest of the new Russian Empire turned out to be the first false note
Hmm.
fiddle.
Thank you. In fact, it occurs to me that loanword is probably a calque and therefore almost a loanword, right? It's Leihwort in German. People were using Leihwort before they were using loanword, weren't they? I'm looking at. I don't know. I'll have to look it up.
Before I thank Han Saussy, I just want to remind you that there is a very nice reception. What? Oh, there's. Now you can hear me, right? Oh. Same mutatis mutandis. Speaking of portmanteau, we should talk about portmanteau. In any case, I want to remind you that there is a very nice reception upstairs waiting for you in room 284, I believe, right? Yeah. Catered, and it should be very nice. So let me also thank Han Saussy very much again for his lecture.
Thank you.